I don't want you to not connect and dive deep into the love part because you're so afraid to lose. The risk of loss should not outweigh the love and connection that you want to feel to your child. You will have what it takes because that child came to you for a reason. And I know with all the synchronicities and how my kids came to be in my life, there's no other way. But I really want you to talk about those fears and let them go so that you can have a birth experience that's not in the back of your head.
Welcome to the Birth Education Center podcast, hosted by myself, Care Messer, an entrepreneur, birth educator, and doula. My team and I want to help you discover your options in birth and postpartum, how to find your voice, and how to use that voice to navigate our maternal healthcare system. You and your baby are not just a number. This information includes doulas too. Now let's get started.
Ashley and I are doing today's show with a lot of compassion and consideration to how we're going to handle this topic because we have pregnant individuals listening. And this is one of the biggest fears that comes up in class right off the bat. It's one of the earliest fears that people talk to me about even before they've signed up for classes. And it needs to be acknowledged. I think we all need to face, what if we have children with special needs? What does that look like? What do we do? What do we expect? For the majority of you, it's never going to happen, but it's top of the list of fears. What if my kid has autism? What if my kid has 20 heart valves? What if my kid doesn't have a limb? What if my kid, right? The list goes on because of what we've either seen in our lives or we just want a perfect kid because that's all we think we can handle. So as we talk about this today, I know there's going to be questions that come up, and Ashley and I are very open to answering anything that you want to talk about. And if we need to do a follow-up episode, we're happy to do that. I hope that we handle it with as much class and confidence and compassion as this subject needs to be talked about because both of us have special needs kids. And as I was thinking about it, Ashley, a lot of the teachers that we've had come through the center have also had special needs kids, which wasn't by design. I didn't say, hey, here's an ad for a teacher. You have to have a handicapped child. I didn't say that, but it's amazing how we all have such different facets of our lives when children show up. We never know what we're going to get. Is there anything you want to say before we start driving in?
Yeah, it is funny that you mentioned that. I hadn't really thought about that, but I think that it speaks a lot to what draws us to doula work. And sometimes it's our birth, right? Sometimes it's how well it goes or how hard it was. But I think when there's that added layer of an unexpected disability or difficulty in parenting where we need and desire so much more compassion and support, probably more than what we're actually getting, that it really feeds that drive to get into some type of work that is an act of service, that we can pay that compassion forward and pour out what we need ourselves. And so it makes a lot of sense to me that people with special needs kids end up going into doula work, which is also just so funny because it's such a high intensity work and such crazy hours and all of that stuff that why don't we just add it on to our already crazy lives at home?
We're equipped to handle the crazy. So
exactly. So yeah, it actually makes a lot of sense to me. And I think that it's part of what's created such a magical dynamic with the people that we've worked with in our curriculum and all of that stuff. I'm actually excited to talk about this. I feel like it's part of our lives that isn't always super apparent. It doesn't always come to the surface. And sometimes I feel like as a birth worker, it can be a little bit like, do I mention it to families? Because I know that it's the top of their fear list. Like you said, it comes up in every single class. It comes up in prenatals. And then when I go, well, actually, I have 2 kids with special needs. It's like, oh my gosh, like that. If it happened to her, it could happen to me. And so I do always have that fear of putting it out there that it's going to compound their fears. But I feel like that my journey with it and your journey has really brought me around to being able to talk to parents about it and families about it in a way that's really, you don't have to be scared. It's going to be okay.
Yeah, it's life. There's risk in life. And we have to dive into the risk if we want to love deeply. So I want to start out with, Ashley, I think we should talk about the early days with our kids and how that evolved. You've listened to my birth story with Finley. Obviously, she lost oxygen early on, where some kids can lose it for 5 minutes and be perfectly fine. And with her, it short-circuited muscles, brain, developed into cerebral palsy, epilepsy, etc. And the early days, I was just so grateful she was here that I overlooked anything that looked out of the ordinary or wasn't a milestone she was hitting, because she's alive and I didn't care. And I think that was really hard for my soon-to-be ex-husband, because I was in denial 100%. Like, we had therapies coming to the house. I devoted every ounce of my time into making sure she was sitting up, moving, her neck was strong, like whatever it was that normal, quote unquote, kids were doing. That was my goal, because like, she's alive, so there's got to be a reason for that. Not that I was attached to an outcome of she's going to be walking and running and speaking and all of that, but there were so many unknowns, you just don't know. So I didn't want anyone to sell her short, and I definitely didn't want to sell her short, because a kid that can live through a completely asleep brain and come back from that, I didn't want to sell that potential short. So whether it was denial or not, I remember my husband saying, I don't know why you're wasting all this time. She's not going to get any better. And I was crushed. I was like, wow, we're not a team. This is going to be me doing this. And I already had an 11-year-old that was seeing that everything was going into Finley because it had to. She needed 24-hour care. It really disrupted everything, and trying to balance making sure Angie was taken care of and nurtured because she was so incredibly smart and talented, and making sure that we went to the pool with her and did the water polo meets and everything, no matter what. It was tricky. And once I became single, it was even more tricky. So those early days looked like a lot of advocating. What else can we do? What other programs are there offered? I am blessed to be in California, where there are 1.5 million programs and a lot of funding that allowed me to still work, as well as get her into programs that could further her brain development, her body development. And then there were also the things of she wasn't hitting goals, and the therapies were starting to go away, because if you're not hitting the goals they need to set, they're not going to pay for therapy anymore. So I felt like everyone around me was starting to give up on her before we started. And it was devastating, because that's your kid. And Anna Verwal, who you will meet in a while with some episodes that are coming up, was one of my mentors. And she had a medical intuit that she said, let her look at Finn and let her look at her body and see what comes up. And at the time, I didn't believe in psychics. I was very Mormon but she said medical intuit. If this woman would do diagnoses for Harvard and Stanford, if they couldn't figure a cancer out, they would call her and she would tell them where it was in the body and whatever. So to me, I was like, oh, it's a gift. It's not a psychic ability. Anyway, I talked to her. Her name was Marissa, and she went through her body. She knew everything about her. And she said, oh, she's supposed to swim with wild whales. And I'm like, what? Wild whales? And she said, yeah, dolphins, whales. Yeah, they're going to wake up her brain. And I was like, oh, cool. I live by SeaWorld. And she said, no, wild whales. And I was like, so I went on this, wild whales. How do I do that? At that time, my husband had moved out of the house and we were on a trial separation. And I was by myself thinking, how am I going to pay for this? What do I do? I found a place in Florida, a place in Hawaii that was for birth dolphins, and couldn't find wild whales that weren't trained. And she made it very clear that these whales were not in with human contact all the time. They came in pods. They came and go as they went. Anna Verwal happened to be in Tenerife on a birth retreat over there. And she said, you'll never believe who I met. There are some German researchers here who take people out into the water with these wild whales, and they've been doing healing journeys ever since. You would be the first American they would allow in their program. And if you can get here in 3 or 4 weeks, you can go out with them. And this was like, I think that was like end of October, and we were supposed to be there by December. Within 3 weeks, the birth community had rallied around and come up with $17,000 for us to go to Tenerife, get passports, be in Spain. Peggy Reynolds came with me, who is a craniosacral therapist, a lactation consultant, as my extra adult. Angie went as well. It was a life-changing experience in the middle of the ocean with whales and baby whales, pilot whales that literally swam around my child for over 3 weeks and woke up her brain. She was a different child by the time we came back. It was very healing for Angie and I. We got to swim with the whales and they did a lot of healing on us as well. And it was a switch. And it was one of those synchronicity moments that were in my life that, okay, there's a bigger plan here. I don't understand it, but this child is here for a reason. She's here. I'm just going to go with it. And you hear from everybody, you're crazy. This is a waste of time. Sometimes they don't say it, but you can read it on their face. And as a special needs mom, that is one of the hardest things, to feel like you have people that want to support you, but they're so afraid you're going to be disappointed that they won't put the full on effort in because they're worried about, how do I support her if it fails? You know what? I'm going all in. Then we cry together. That's how I want you to support me, because I'm doing it anyway. So fast forward to a couple weeks later, Finny needed to have double hip surgery. Her femur needed to be adjusted. Hardware needed to be put in her hip so that we'd have a chance at her walking, finding a gait to be mobile at some point. And I was going to be by myself in the hospital. My ex-husband did come for half of that time, but it was almost a 2-week stay. She was in something called a spica cast, where you're in a cast from the waist down and it kind of arches your body. And there's one little hole to pee and poop through, which I can't even explain it. And at that point, she had very runny green stool all the time. It wasn't a regular poop situation for her. And the nurses were helping me do it. And it was lining the cotton inside with this smell. And they were like, you have to be really careful to pack everything in so that she doesn't develop bacteria and diseases and skin disorders and stuff. It was so hard. And I went to her preschool the day before we got out and asked the teacher, I said, I don't know what I'm going to do. And I was sobbing. And I said, I'm going to be by myself. I have to carry her with this. I need you to show me how you manage this in a classroom. And she said, oh yeah, come on. And I'll show you how we do it. And as we were walking into the school, there was a little girl that had the wheelchair that kind of looked like Finley's. And I said, oh, look, she's got Finley's wheelchair. It was like her gait trainer thing. And she said, oh, that's one of the triplets. And I said, triplets? And she said, yeah, that's her little brother and that's her little brother. And there was one little boy on the ground with hearing aids and couldn't walk, couldn't move, just was laying there. And the other one could scoot, had a hearing aid and glasses, and was on a feeding tube. And I looked at the teacher, and mind you, I was sobbing because I had this cast that I was going to have to deal with for the next, 6 to 8 weeks, maybe longer. And I looked at her and I said, triplets? And if you can imagine a cartoon with tears sucking back up into your eyes, when I thought, how does that woman get out of bed every day and do 3? And I said, I don't know how she does that. And they said, yeah. She said, yeah, they're really amazing parents. They had to take a mortgage out on their house to get a van that would hold 3 children plus the wheelchairs and all that. And I was so overwhelmed by what she was going through that I thought, I can freaking do anything. And I have since come to know that just because my perception that somebody else had it harder does not lessen what I'm going through. But at the time, I immediately did not feel alone. And I thought, if she can get up every day and do 3, I can do one with special needs and one that's helping me cope with special needs. And it really did shift my perception, my understanding of how strong you actually can be and are to be placed in that situation. And I still think about that mom. I don't know her. I don't know that dad. And God bless them, because this is a hard road that we don't choose. And I support them wherever they are. So those were my early days.
Yeah. Again, it's like our stories, they like mirror each other in opposite ways. And then I also just love that you wrapped up your story with triplets, leading into me talking about triplets. So by now, most people who listen to this know that I have triplets, and 2 of my triplets have special needs. But when we talk about my pregnancy was charmed in terms of a triplet pregnancy, in terms of how long I carried them and how big they were and all of that stuff. But both of my daughters, I have 2 girls and a boy, have special needs that are very different from each other. And one of them was diagnosed in my pregnancy as having a condition that we knew could possibly lead to more special needs down the line. And then the other one had a difficult birth, as well as some genetic factors that led to what you would consider more of a autism spectrum disorder, which is more like social, emotional, mental disabilities rather than physical. My daughter, who had the diagnosis in pregnancy, that was the first big speed bump that we hit in our pregnancy. At one of my anatomy scans that they said, so we were looking at her brain and she has big ventricles. And I was like, what does big ventricles mean? What is a ventricle? And they're like, your ventricles in your brain are your storage units for your cerebrospinal fluid, which is our fluid that bathes our brain and our spine and keeps that all functioning how it's supposed to. And hers are dilated. They're bigger than they should be, which means she has more fluid in her brain than she should have. More commonly known when you are not pregnant, when they're out in the world, as hydrocephalus. But basically, she had too much fluid in her brain. And this left us with a lot of what ifs. We did genetic testing just to make sure there wasn't something bigger going on that we needed to sort of be prepared for. So all three of them had their genetics looked at for the severe genetic disorders, and all of their brains looked okay otherwise. And yeah, I had the type of triplet pregnancy where they all had their own placentas, they all had their own sacs. It was essentially like 3 separate pregnancies. So whatever was going on with her was just going on with her. But we can see and understand so little. I even think back to like I had an MRI when I was 27 weeks pregnant with triplets because they were trying so hard to get a good picture of her brain. Again, no real answers, just, yep, she has this fluid. Although the comforting thing was when we did, our continued ultrasound scans, the fluid eventually stabilized at a certain amount. And when they looked at the rest of her brain tissue, it looked alive. It looked healthy. It looked gray and thick and like how it's supposed to look on ultrasound. It didn't look squished. She was moving around. She was practice breathing. She was otherwise doing all the things that a baby should typically do. But we just didn't know. And they knew when she was born that she was definitely going to be assessed by NICU just to make sure, like, can she breathe on her own? Is she acting like a typical newborn? Is she going to need a NICU stay? Is she going to need surgery right away? Because sometimes the surgery required to correct hydrocephalus needs to happen right after a baby's born if they have so much excess fluid in their brain. Luckily, she didn't have so much excess fluid in her brain. And when she was born, she very much presented like a typical newborn. And she was the first one to leave the NICU and join me in my room. I was shocked when they brought her to me. I was like, but wait, this one has hydrocephalus. Did they tell you this one has hydrocephalus? Why are you bringing her to me? And they're like, she's great. She's doing great. And so at the time, we were sort of just like, I think very similarly to how you were with Finley, where it's like, she's here. Everything's great. This is how it's supposed to be. She's here. Because we were just so pleased that she was here and she was healthy, there wasn't this overwhelming doom and gloom like there was in the pregnancy. They never were able to really give me an answer in pregnancy as to why that happened, why she had extra fluid. But then they did an initial ultrasound after she was born, determined she didn't need surgical intervention right away, referred us to neurosurgery. And that was who was going to be following us to keep an eye on it. And in the same moment of their birth, Isabella was born struggling. My other daughter's name is Sophia. I don't think I said that. Isabella was born struggling. She is the reason I had an emergency C-section, and she was revived when she was born. She wasn't born breathing. She had a really hard time. And then she also, because of that, struggled a little bit in the hospital before we were discharged. She had a lot of really painful procedures done. She had a lot of rough handling because when they revive a baby, it can be very intensive. And some of my child development background told me definitely need to keep an eye on this because I know that it can lead to some sensory stuff. And just, I definitely had that awareness, but I was also very young and I didn't really have a full understanding of what different diagnoses would mean. And even in my head, autism sounded like the worst case scenario. Like autism is the thing that happens where you have a typical child and then they hit a certain age and they just disappear and they stop talking and they completely go away. And so I, like many parents my age, was very afraid of autism and the diagnosis and everything that came with it. So that was never even on my radar for the first 2-3 years of her life, although she was very quirky. And looking back now, the signs were always there. The signs were literally always there. The flappies and the spinnies and the rocking and the babbling that wasn't typical toddler speak. Once you get that autism diagnosis and you start learning more about exactly what it is and how it manifests, and especially how it manifests in girls, because for so long, autism was looked at as a boy's disorder, much like ADHD was. Hello, I have ADHD. There's no typical look to it. It is truly a spectrum. And number two, it can look very different in little girls than it looks in little boys. And looking back now, it was so clear always that her brain was wired differently and that her birth did not help, especially when your brain is wired differently and you go through a trauma. It can definitely have lasting effects, and it definitely did impact her in terms of sensory issues and stuff like that. Autism is more what we consider like a developmental disorder, and our understanding of it is that there's definitely a genetic component. I'm sure if I was screened now with our understanding of how women and girls have autism, I probably would show up on the spectrum, not just having ADHD, but also being autistic with probably lower support needs. That really started to manifest itself actually for both girls as they got a little older, kind of like Finley, like when they're babies, we're getting through the feedings and we're getting through the diapers and all of that stuff.
And we still have the denial of their
Yes,
perfect,
they're just
amazing
babies.
kids because there are babies.
Yep. And it was just so funny because they're just total opposites. And it's because of their issues that they were dealing with. Sophia was my little potato who just laid there and didn't do much and was more behind on the gross motor skills. And Bella was rolling over by 2 months, like rolling over and fully picking her head up and trying to get up into a crawl position by 2.5 months old. She was pushing herself up into a seated position by 5 months old. She was pulling up and standing by 6 months old. Like, she was advanced in gross motor skills. Red flag. But at the time, it's, oh, she's so advanced. But those advanced gross motor skills are definitely a sign that there is something different going on with her brain. And just her need to constantly, she needed to be moving. She always needed to be on the move. But they don't diagnose autism till age 3 because there are just other pieces they need to see that confirm it, that in a baby you just can't, in terms of communication, eye contact, how they react to certain situations, that they really need to be coming out of that toddler age to really be able to call it what it is. But with Sophia, we were followed by neurosurgery, and we were keeping an eye on the fact that, her gross motor skills were a little bit behind, but nobody ever put a label on that. They just called it low muscle tone. She's a little softer. They would jokingly say, oh, she's a little squishy. She's a little floppy, but nobody ever labeled it anything. And ultimately that was to our detriment and something that we had to come back around to later. But with the hydrocephalus itself, the fluid in her brain itself, neurosurgery at a certain point said, hey, we think we should intervene. We don't want the fluid to increase to a point where it really starts to have impacts on her. She is falling a little behind in terms of gross motor skills. Her head size is getting a little bigger than we are comfortable with. And we want to try the surgery that we do where we don't leave any hardware in her body. We create a natural gravity-based bypass to allow the fluid to flow, because what she had was not an excess of cerebral spinal fluid, but a blockage. And so knowing that, she's not making too much fluid. It can't get out. It goes into her brain and can't get back out the way it's supposed to. Let's make this bypass and all of that. So she had surgery on April 9th of 2012. She was 15 months old, and it actually went perfectly. We were only in the hospital for a couple of days. But we still celebrate the anniversary of her surgery every year because it's a big deal to get your brain fixed. And then that was sort of it with Sophia for several years. Bella was diagnosed with autism at age 3 because we really hit that age 3 with gusto, and she stopped sleeping. She started having more what they call like sensory meltdowns, and we hit basically critical mass in terms of, this is definitely not a typical 3-year-old, and we have 2 other 3-year-olds and we don't know what to do. And thankfully, that diagnosis opened up a whole well of therapies and supports to try and keep her on the right track that we did all the way up until we moved a couple years ago. Thank you to the services in California, and honestly thankful to that diagnosis. As afraid as I was of it, as soon as they put that diagnosis on her paper, it opened everything up to her. It gave her therapies. It opened up to make sure she had an individualized education plan in school, to make sure the school supplied therapies to her. And it allowed us to continue to make sure she gets the support she needs. And if I would not have accepted that label, if I would have continued to live afraid of what that might mean, who knows where we would be right now. And I think that's something that a lot of parents have a hard time coming to terms with. Sophia's journey was a lot of, we fixed her brain. And overall, she seems like she's doing good. And she's just a little squishy. And maybe she's not going to be an athlete. And yeah, she gets tired sometimes. Maybe she just doesn't have the same energy as the other kids. No red flag at all that we still had to always make sure we had a stroller with us at the zoo or at Disneyland or even at the mall for our 6-year-old, because if she got tired halfway through, my husband would have to carry her to the car. I think that we were aware of it, but overall she seemed okay, that we just missed it like everybody else missed it. Until about 7 years old, when she started coming home every single day and actually every night at bedtime complaining about how her feet were hurting her. And another thing we really didn't notice is that just how much time she spent actually walking on her toes, sort of up in a high heel position. And she was in pain all the time. We had moved on to a new pediatrician, and that new pediatrician, I went to her and I said, this has been a couple years of this where she's just, her back hurts, her legs hurt, her feet hurt, to the point where I don't think this is growing pains. I don't think this is normal. I think there's something else going on. And she was like, me too. And she sent us to the children's hospital. And in the same day, we had appointments with neurology and orthopedics/rehab medicine. And both of those appointments confirmed with each other, this child has diplegic cerebral palsy affecting both sides of her body, more affected on the right side. And again, cerebral palsy is another thing that people hear and they think a birth injury, it's going to be diagnosed right at birth because there was an injury that takes place. And Sophia didn't have a birth injury. She had a pregnancy injury, but she spent the first 8 years of her life of everybody just looking at her like, she's doing okay. She's doing okay. That we lost 8 years of potential therapy, supports, all of that stuff because we did not have that diagnosis of cerebral palsy. Then we were fast-tracked basically into very intensive therapies to try and make up for lost time addressing her pain. And then we also went through casting, not as intensive as the spica casting, but she did end up needing casts on both her feet. Because it turns out when you walk like you're in high heels and you're 8 years old, it means that your Achilles heel is too short. And so we had to stretch her Achilles heel out by putting her in casts in the middle of summertime. She also went through a huge growth spurt, which with cerebral palsy is so hard because nothing stretches how it's supposed to, or it stretches too much. And it's still an ongoing thing. We're still making up for lost time. She was just approved for a wheelchair. She is an ambulatory wheelchair user. She is incredible and also disabled. And I have one who has developmental disability and I have one who has a physical disability, and they're both on their own trajectories, and we're cresting the teen years, and it definitely is proving to be its own kind of difficult. Each of them individually, how the disabilities impact now as they're becoming teenagers. But that's our journey, how we got here. I know it's long-winded, but when you're talking about 2 kids, I tried to make sure I fit in as much of it as I could without telling the whole story. But yeah, so I sort of ended up with 2 categories of disabled children that people are both very afraid of having, and they're both amazing. And here we are still surviving at 12 years old.
Well, and I think that's why, at least for me, why I relate so heavily to the postpartum time for families, because at 15, since my diagnoses are a little different than Ashley's, I'm still changing diapers. They're big diapers now. And Finley's almost 90 pounds of dead weight. She doesn't walk. She can't really tell you unless she's screaming that she's uncomfortable. So there's not communication there. She does not sleep. And that is I think that's my hardest thing, is that I operate on 2 hours of sleep most of the time, running a business as a single mom, picking up placentas in the middle of the night, loading her up in the wheelchair to go and do that. which I love. I can't complain about that because placentas are like one of my favorite things to do, but it's hard. And that's why we talk a lot about postpartum in our classes, because I'm still living it. And I want you to be as prepared as possible, because living on no sleep, like some days I look pretty wretched, and Ashley will tell you like, whoa, it's been a bad night. I'm like, I know I need more makeup, huh? She's like, yeah, you do. And she'll send me back in, which is good. I'm glad that she cares enough to say, you look like shit, get out. But even as Finley got older, we didn't have child support for many years because her dad disappeared. And I had to figure out how to buy a car that would accommodate her. And then once I couldn't lift her in and out of that Honda CRV anymore, how do we get a van? There was a van contest. And so we did a big social media campaign, and we didn't win that van. It went to some people that really needed it, which is awesome. But then a year later, the news station that helped us contacted me again, and he's like, I think we can do this. Like, I've thought about it for a year. I can't believe we didn't get you that van. And they did another media campaign, and within 2 weeks we had a van on the way. And that has been the biggest blessing of my life with her, because she has cortical visionary impairment for her eyes, that she sees the world when she's moving. And so for her to be sedentary and just sitting or in just a chair for too long, she gets very antsy because her whole world stops. When you're in a van, she is a different human. She's got her head up. She's looking around. She's smiling. She's laughing. If there's bumps, she's giggling. She gets so much enjoyment from being in a van. So you don't even know how many miles are on that van all the time, and how many tires I've gone through, and how many brakes, and now I need shocks. It's ridiculous, but I am so grateful for it. As hard as those things pop up, there are also those moments of gratitude and blessings that I call synchronicities, how things line up. And I want you to know that if you do have a kid with special needs, that same exact stuff will show up for you. I believe we have angels and guides that are on the other side working for that. So state your need, ask for help, and watch what happens, because you can't do this by yourself. You can't. And as a single mom, yeah, everyone says, you're so strong. I can't believe you can do this. I'm like, I don't do it by myself. Yeah, there are days and there are times when I don't ask for help, but you do it as a village. And people have come out of the woodwork over the years to help me with her, especially the birth community. But in that transition of having a special needs kid, there's grief and gratitude are sisters, and they walk side by side. Every time when Finn was little and I saw a little girl dancing around, prancing around in her little princess dress, or spinning in a tutu, or thinking about Angie when she got to be Tinkerbell for a couple of years on Halloween, and how amazing that pretend time was. And it's hard to think about all of that. It's a lot of loss. While you're so grateful on one hand for all the yummy things, that she's here, she's alive, she's still my baby, you miss out on the normalcy things that you thought you'd be doing, PTA mom and cupcakes and birthday parties, and everything just looks different. You still have them, but it looks different, and you don't have little kids running around. It would have been so much easier to build a business with a typical kid than it was with Finley, who I had to have nurses, or Angie stay home from high school activities to watch her so that I could teach. Angie gave up her whole high school to help me with Finley. And I will be forever. I don't know if she sees it like that. I do, because I know what she gave up. She tried to do track and water polo and things like that. And we did them, but we didn't do them as much as we could have because of what she gave up to help me raise Finley. And the other part too, I don't even know if I should mention it, but dating is really hard when you have a special needs kid, for one, because I am very protective. And my thoughts at the time were, if her own dad would leave and never show back up, how could I expect another man to take her in? And that's me projecting a story on somebody, because I know that there is somebody out there at some point. But I had big guards up because no one's going to touch my girls. And now I'm at a point where I love being single and not having to answer to anybody. And girl dinner is a thing at my house. But at the same time, I've had a lot of friends that have tried to set me up over the years. And I had one person who I loved, and he said, I have this person in my life who would be awesome. He's dated moms with special needs before. I mean, I could never do it, but he could totally take that on. Like I could never take that on. And I was taken aback by that because I know he didn't mean it the way it sounded, but that was another, oh, he just othered me. He put me in that category. Like, you're not worth dating because of the baggage that you have. No matter how amazing you are, I could fix you up with someone, but I could never do that. And at the time I'm thinking, you've got a 2-year-old. What if that kid shows up with special needs? Would you just walk away? Like, I love my kid just as much as you love your kid. I didn't say this, but my child means just as much to me as yours does. I would die for my child just like you would die for your child. My child is not in an other category, although kids with special needs, especially Finley, when they are so dramatically, obviously different than a normal, typical kid. And that's part of the grief. Every time I take her out, like we go to the bay all the time, we go to Miramar Lake, we walk, people stare at her constantly. And some days it's no big deal. And we walk and I smile at everybody. Most of the time they look right through me. They're not even looking at me. I become invisible, and all that attention is, their faces change. They're delving deep. And I know they're trying to assess, who is this? What are they? What's wrong with them? It's different. And I understand that psychological thing. But as a mom, when that happens over and over, and some days it's been hard. We haven't slept for 3 or 4 days and we just have to get out because she's crying and I'm over it, cannot handle it anymore because it's been like 20 hours of crying. And then to have everybody, wherever you go, stare at your kid, pull their kids close so their kids won't accidentally say something, cover their kids' eyes and move them. You guys, I've heard everything. Kids say the weirdest things. So what? They're kids. But I've also heard parents say stuff. And she's retarded. That's why she looks that way, right? The one word you should never use with special needs families, right?
The hairs on my neck and my whole scalp stand up.
Yep.
Yeah.
And it's one of the hardest words. And Angie would hear that word in high school and jump down somebody's throat. That's a very hard word. It's an old fashioned word, right? That's a boomer word. It is a word we do not use now. And it crushes me. And at the same time, I get it. I also want to tell you that Gen A kids, this Gen Alpha generation, are so compassionate and so curious and so amazing with Finley. When their mom says, "Can she meet your daughter?" Yes. I like that. The kids are more interested in the cool wheelchair that's glitter than they are with my kid. And that's, we have a conversation like, you drive in a car with 4 wheels and she gets to be in this with 4 wheels. We can explain it on a level that they understand. And they're like, why does she have that music? I'm like, that's her favorite toy. And we can have that discussion. She's a human that looks different. And to be othered constantly is a really hard part about being a special needs parent. While I understand it, sorry, this is a really emotional issue for me.
And we knew that it would be.
It doesn't get any easier. And I thought over the years it would. I do have more compassion for it. But she's still my baby, even though she's 15. And kids, those older children that I see, and Angie when she was that age, and you still miss out on those things. And while I'm so grateful to have her, the grief part of my life stopping 15 years ago. I don't sew anymore. I can't travel. I haven't seen the Northern Lights. I haven't been to Switzerland. Things that I thought I would do. And now I would love to have a container home that's big enough for her wheelchairs and her equipment and have 20 Pomeranians. It's shifted, but you do think about those things. Like it changes everything. And while I don't want you to think that it's like a death diagnosis, like it's such a horrible thing, because it's not. But I think, my business would even be in a different place if I had a typical kid, right? I still haven't been able to teach in person since the pandemic because I don't have nursing care for her. And that slowed my business down a lot. And it's not where I want to be, but it is where I am. And I'm grateful that I can still teach and I can still support my family because I have, I believe, guides looking out for me, people in the community looking out for me. And we are not given anything we can't handle. And I'm sure, Ashley, you've heard too, I don't know how you do it. I could never do it.
Oh my God. And that's for sure more in relation to the fact that I have triplets than anything. But then when people hear the diagnoses on top of that, it just compounds that, oh my God, that's crazy. But as we talk about this stuff, I also just think about how I'm really blessed to have an incredible partner in my husband who picks up the slack, who is super involved with our kids. He has such a deeply emotional connection to all three of our kids and is able to really be a present parent when I am just constantly having to do checklist stuff of like appointments and phone calls and messages and all of that. And that has made a huge difference, but there's still three of them and two of us, and I have these two girls with these incredibly demanding needs for me. It feels just like this sort of constant weight, this constant thing that I'm always thinking about. But I feel like when it comes to parents of kids with disabilities and kids with disabilities altogether, it's like they're either too disabled to be acknowledged or they're not disabled enough to be acknowledged. And that's really where my girls fall into that category of, they look okay. They look fine. That whole just constantly putting people into categories and othering people and trying to assign people whatever level of disabled you are is like the level of value that you have or the level of burden that you are is exhausting to me. And the grief of just like the constant worry about, am I doing enough? Am I doing too much? What is the right amount of intervention? When do I let go of the reins a little bit? And am I assigning too much disability to them when I should really be treating them more like a typical child? And I hear that constantly of like, they're not a cripple, especially when it comes to Sophia. She's not a cripple. You can't let her think she's a cripple, but she has a physical disability. I don't know what to say about that. And then thinking about their futures, like for Isabella, like navigating a brain that is not neurotypical going through middle school and high school and college and relationships and living on her own is so scary to me because I know how people with sort of developmental disabilities and people on the autism spectrum and even people with other social emotional difficulties are taken advantage of or abused or fall through the cracks and can be easily victimized. That's a really scary prospect for me. And then with Sophia, it's like she has so much ambition, but I feel like she's in this body that, although she's very typically presenting, holds her back from being able to fully live out as like a typical child. And I feel like the second I take my foot off the gas, things start to fall apart. And I feel like I'm constantly walking this line of like, step on the gas. They have disabilities. They need advocacy. They need support. Wait, that's too much. You're putting labels on them. Like my hair is literally falling out from the stress of it. And that's been a real struggle. And then also like when you have kids that have lower support needs, even physicians, and Karen and I have talked about doctors, firing doctors, and how they will other kids and when kids are severely disabled, treat them as if they have no feelings and no consciousness and they're not experiencing anything. And then on the other end of the spectrum, I had a pediatric orthopedic physician tell my daughter with a diagnosis of cerebral palsy, I think what you're really dealing with is a confidence issue. It's a confidence issue that she has a brain injury and muscular deficiencies. It became so much more severe very shortly after that basically this doctor was saying, stop using a wheelchair and just get her some confidence and she'll be okay. And then ultimately she needed casting. She almost needed surgery. She needed all of these therapies. I fired that doctor That was so traumatic to hear her tell me, I gave your daughter this diagnosis of cerebral palsy 6 months ago, but now I'm telling you, I think it's just a confidence issue. When I'm like, I live with this little girl, a confidence issue. Oh, and she told me, maybe you need to just make her world smaller and stop taking her to the zoo and stop taking her to the mall and stop taking her to Disneyland until she can walk herself. And I was like, so basically keep her at home because her body doesn't work like her siblings. I could have thrown up. And when I still think about it, it literally, I can feel my temperature rising in my body. But it's just that I will never be able to let my guard down. And that's, as a parent, something that you will always carry around with you. But there's just these additional layers on top of it with these girls that I need to have my advocate hat on 24/7. I can never let my guard down. I have to constantly be managing things and working on things. And like I said, the checklist never ends. As soon as you have a child with this diagnosis, yes, the responsibility increases exponentially.
I think that's one of the reasons that we really go in depth with advocacy in our birth classes, because you need to advocate for yourself 100%. But if that baby went to the NICU, or if your baby later has a diagnosis, or if you have a breastfeeding issue or whatever, you are the one that has to have a voice to say, this is not working. I know what you're telling me, but I need a different answer. And especially with the special needs kid, I had a doctor who we were going to regularly for Botox injections. And at one of these visits, he could not find the right place to get the shots in the muscle. And so he was digging around, and she was screaming bloody murder, like she was being tortured. And then he'd put the machine on and go to the other side. And I said, you've got to stop. He's like, oh, we could have given her Versed and she would have been, in a sedated state. And I looked at him and I said, there's a medicine that could have put her in a sedated state so she wouldn't feel this. And he goes, oh yeah. And I was like, okay, I'm at Children's Hospital. And this is a doctor who sees children like this all the time. But my kid was in an other category. Just let them scream. They're not going to remember it. It doesn't matter if they feel pain. Yeah, it does. Because my daughter is just as human with the same feelings as your daughter is. But yet mine wasn't worthy of medication. You didn't even think about that for my daughter. Are you fucking kidding me? I was so angry at that appointment. We stopped. We didn't finish the last leg. And I left. And I did call him and have a meeting with him after I had cooled off because I left sobbing. I was so upset and angry. And it took me weeks to get over that, to think, okay, I love him. He is an incredible doctor. This was a big, oh my gosh, moment for him as well. So how do we work through this as adults so that he doesn't ever do this again? Because in society, we other handicapped people, we don't want to live that life. We feel sorry for them, but it's too painful to watch and too uncomfortable. I get it. I'm sorry that what I'm going through or my daughter's going through is uncomfortable for you. It's still reality. And we can still support each other. And our society's not set up for that. I think it's getting more that way. But your advocacy starts in birth classes for yourself, because you're going to have a typically normal child or not. Your advocacy and you knowing something's not okay about your kid is important. And if you don't do it, no one's going to do it. And it's hard to go through. I feel like what we've talked about is so heavy and so overwhelming. I do have to tell you one thing. If you see carts at the grocery store, at Target, in the blue striped lines by a handicap stall, can you please move them? We are so careless with, I just got to get home. And we throw our carts in those blue striped lines where it might be a military vet that is trying to get out of their van and they have to not pull all the way in. They don't have legs and they have to get their wheelchair put together and out to move the carts out, to pull their van in that place. And then they have to figure out how to get through the maze of those carts to get into Target. And sometimes those carts are left by people with disabilities because they can't put them back after they've loaded their car with groceries. They put their wheelchair back into their van, and they do leave them there. Can we just be a little more cautious and thoughtful? But things like that really help people out that are struggling with things you don't know they're struggling with. And I always thank people when I see them doing it. I'm like, thank you so much. They'll see that I pull in and there's 6 carts there. I can't even deploy the ramp until I go move all those. That's just a side note of some courtesy.
Well, I was going to say too, I think it's really important also to be aware that when you see somebody parking in a handicap spot with a handicap placard or license plate, even if they don't have a wheelchair van like Finley has, it's not your place to question whether or not they should be in that handicap place. When you see a kid get out of the car and walk to their wheelchair or walk into the store, sometimes Sophia walks into the store and we'll use like the special cart in the store. Or if we're only there for 5 minutes, she can walk around a little bit. Not all disabilities are visible. Some people with high support needs autism have that, or kids with high support needs autism have that because their kid runs away and they need to be able to get as close to the store as possible. Some people live with chronic pain. My daughter lives with chronic pain. And that really goes back to what we've been talking about. There's no right or wrong way to be disabled. We all have to prove that our disability or a child's disability to get those placards. Nobody's faking their way into getting a placard. And if we can all do our part to respect the handicap spaces, to keep carts out of the way, and just let people live, let them exist, and without being like, should they be parked there? They look awfully young. The community is really what we need for all of us to get through this. And for our families, I think that othering and that burden that society puts on us of like, how disabled are you? Look how they're so severely disabled. Put them in this category, put them in that category. All of this othering adds to those fears that our parents have about bringing a child into this world. It's other people that make us scared to have a special needs child, because it's how we move through this world, seeing how other people treat people with special needs, how they talk about them, how they are ignored in society, how they're pushed to the side, how even the things we set up for them to be successful, like handicap parking and stuff like that, is used and abused. Like the special needs cart at Target, guys, it's not for playing around with or putting your healthy child in. It's there so people who can't walk can utilize it. And the same way that I want there to be more supports for parents, when I see teenagers using the cart at Target that's meant for moms with multiple kids, get off of it and leave it for the people who have multiple kids. Our society is not set up to support parents, and it's definitely not set up to support parents with special needs or people with special needs. Kara and I deeply understand why we have families come in that are scared, but we're also here to tell you that it's going to be okay.
And
it's going to be okay.
I don't love my kid any less than you're going to love your kid. And the funny part to me is, like, Finley doesn't walk, right? So my house is pretty tidy. My crystals are wherever they want to be, on the floor, up above. I got plants everywhere, right? My dogs don't eat my plants. So like my house is such a girl haven. It is. It's beautiful. I love it. If it's a mess, it's because I made the mess. Finn didn't make the mess, right? And you're going to have days where your house is torn apart. There's a magic marker that has been drawn across your entire rental house and then ended up on your wedding dress because your 2-year-old did that, right? That is a hard day. And that's no less hard than me changing 7 diarrhea diapers with a 15-year-old, right? You are going to have hard days with a typically normal kid or a special needs kid. And you're going to have days that are just triumphant and magical and amazing and like memory moments, just like I will have with a special needs kid. It just looks different, but it's the same. And we are all going through ups and downs and struggles, and we're all going through beautiful moments. And as hard as it can be, you're going to have hard days too. And your hard days might not happen until they're teenagers, or it might not happen until they're 25. We never stop being a parent. I don't know why we think we have 18 years with our kids. What a crock, man. They're still calling for money and help and make me dinner and whatever. It's not true. It's such a lie. I feel like we should give you a glimpse into what a life can look like, because if those are fears, the way we disable fears and dispel them is to communicate about them. What would you and your partner do? You're going to love this baby no matter what, right? You're not going to just drop it off on the corner like I would abandon a dog. You're not going to do that. So have conversations. What would that look like? What kind of therapies are available in your state? What kind of social workers are at your children's hospital? Like, you don't have to go into that detail, but know that all of that is available. The reason I stay in California is because of the programs for my daughter that allow me to work and contribute and pay taxes. There are some states where I would be completely on welfare and living in sheer poverty in order to keep my kid with me. And I might not be able to keep my kid with me. And that is my number one fear and my number one goal in my life. So know that there are supports and that you're not going to be alone. And that's why people that have kids with disabilities have support groups, and we have such good structures built in so that we can support you if that happens. I will tell you, we have had over the years teaching some kids with special needs and some losses and things like that. But Finn's the hardest one, you guys. And from all of the parents that I have been with, she's the hardest. So if I can do it, I know you can do it. And I don't want you to not connect and dive deep into the love part because you're so afraid to lose. The risk of loss should not outweigh the love and connection that you want to feel to your child. You're going to love them. I promise you. And you will go with the flow of it. And you will have the strength when you need it. You will have what it takes because that child came to you for a reason. And my personal beliefs is we've chosen our families. And I know with all the synchronicities and how my kids came to be in my life, there's no other way. And the journey is going to be beautiful and hard and messy no matter what. And there's support for you. There's support for you. But I really want you to talk about those fears and let them go so that you can have a birth experience that's not in the back of your head.
When I have parents talk about their fear of having a child with special needs, the first thing that I always tell them is bad parents aren't in 5-week birth classes, listening to birth podcasts, wondering if they're going to be equipped to take care of their kid with special needs. Bad parents don't care about the quality of parent they're going to be to their kid. So you're already way ahead of the game. You're already an amazing parent. If you're listening to this podcast to get pregnancy and parenting advice, you are already ahead of the game. You are more equipped than so many parents who unexpectedly have kids with special needs. And the other thing that Karen and I talk about so much is there are no guarantees in this life. When we choose to become parents, it's so cliche. It's literally taking your heart and saying, okay, heart, go walk around outside of my body. Hopefully you'll be okay. Because there are no guarantees. We can have a perfect birth or we can have a hard birth. We can have a perfect newborn. We can have a newborn with unexpected needs, or things can happen later in life. People become disabled later in life all the time. People go through difficult things in their lives all the time. And just in terms of parenting, it's a roller coaster. Even if, let's say, nothing that severe to that extent happens, you're still going to go through devastating things with your kids. You're still going to have the highest of highs with your kids. That parenting is hard and unpredictable and unexpected, regardless of what you are handed in terms of your child's health and well-being. And so it's totally valid to have those fears. And I don't think that there's anything wrong with saying, I want my baby to be healthy. That baseline of wanting everybody to make it out okay, we say all the time, that's the floor. We want everybody to be healthy. That's completely valid. And I think a beautiful thing to have in your mind as a goal for your child. Know that your child who is gestating, is on their way, or is floating around you, getting ready to be conceived, trusts you and is choosing you for a reason, that you are the right parent for this child. When I was told I was having triplets, I was literally like, are you fucking kidding me? No. I'm already worried about getting enough sleep with one baby. What are you talking about? There's 3 of them. But I can't see my life any other way without this set of kids coming together the way that they did. And I know that I'm the right parent for these kids. And I know that I'm trying to do better than the generation of parents before me. And again, if you're listening to a podcast about parenting, or you're taking birth classes, or you're looking at taking birth classes, you're exploring providers, all of these things, if you care enough to try and make conscious choices for your child, you will be fine. Regardless of what your child brings with them or what they experience in their life, you will be okay.
You know what? Actually, that reminds me, I have to tell you this it's a side note funny. It happened in one of my classes. We were in a release and relax class with just a bunch of moms. And one of the moms, I was asking, what are your biggest fears or worries? What's really going on for you today? And one of the moms said, I'm eating a fish fillet sandwich at McDonald's every day during lunch. And I'm not telling my husband about it. And I can't stop eating them. And I feel so bad. I'm poisoning my kid. And she went through this whole thing about how toxic this was for her baby and all the preservatives. And she's been eating organic, but every day she's having that fish fillet and she's feeling so guilty about it. And another mom across the room said, do you do meth? And she went, no. And she goes, you're fine. And everyone just started laughing. And I thought, man, perspective, right? Like, you're worried about a McDonald's fish fillet, which now it sounds really good, by the way. You're not doing meth, girl. You're going to be okay. Keep the perspective that you are here to parent. Your heart is on the outside of your body. And I wouldn't trade my kids for anything. And I would encourage you, at least in my case, the more diagnoses that my kid gets, the more help she gets. I am all about, is there something else wrong? Great. Put it on that diagnosis, because there are
labels.
Yeah. I encourage the labels. Where me growing up with someone calling me crazy all the time, I was very adverse to labels because I carried that with me. It was horrible. But with a special needs kid, you want the labels and you want to know what's actually going on within their body, within their mind, so that you can get the help that you need, because it's only going to help it. Thank you, Ashley, for being so vulnerable with us today. We would love to hear your feedback or questions that you have regarding special needs, or what to do or how to cope with those fears, because they are valid. And know that you're going to get through everything, and we're good resources for that.
Thank you. I actually am really proud to talk about my kids and share their story and their journey, this journey that obviously we're still on. But I hope that it can serve as an inspiration that you can have a beautiful life and have the things that you value and have a beautiful relationship with your children, even if it's not what you expected it to be.
Still your kids. You're still going to love them.
Yep.
All right. We'll see you next week.
Bye.
Thanks for joining us today. And remember, it's your body, your choice, and finding your voice is your power. Be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel, follow us in all the places, and go to birtheducationcenter.com for our blog and more online education classes. And we'll see you next week.